Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. But this isn't just a story about smoking. This is about addiction, ambition, and the intoxicating allure of sin itself. Because in the Roaring Twenties, cigarettes weren't just tobacco wrapped in paper. They were symbols of liberation, tools of seduction, and for many of Hollywood's brightest stars, the gateway to a world of excess that would consume them entirely. Faye, what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you think you know about the glamorous golden age of Hollywood. These weren't just actresses playing roles. They were real women caught in a web of addiction that went far beyond nicotine, trapped between the personas they created on screen and the demons they battled off camera. And the stories I'm going to share with you today have been buried in studio archives, hidden in private letters, and whispered about in Hollywood circles for nearly a century. By the end of this video, you'll understand how cigarettes became the perfect metaphor for everything dangerous and alluring about 1920s Hollywood, and how the women who smoked them paid a price that went far beyond their health. You'll meet the stars who turned smoking into an art form, the studios that exploited their addictions for profit, and the society that both celebrated and condemned their rebellion. Most importantly, you'll discover how these women's struggles with addiction and identity laid the foundation for every scandal, every tragedy, and every triumph that Hollywood has experienced since. Before we dive deep into these individual stories, let me paint you a picture of what Hollywood looked like in 1923. The film industry was still young, still wild, still figuring out its own rules. There were no publicists crafting careful images, no rehab centers standing by, and certainly no understanding of addiction as we know it today. What there was, however, was an unprecedented concentration of young, beautiful, ambitious women who had traveled from small towns across America to chase their dreams in a city that promised everything and delivered chaos. These women arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but talent and determination, only to find themselves thrust into a world where image was everything and excess was expected. The studios controlled every aspect of their lives, from the clothes they wore to the men they dated. But there was one thing the studios couldn't control, one small act of rebellion that belonged entirely to these women themselves, what they chose to put between their lips and light on fire. Enter Clara Bow, the original it girl of Hollywood. Clara didn't just smoke cigarettes, she wielded them like weapons of mass seduction. Born into poverty in Brooklyn, Clara had clawed her way to the top of Hollywood's food chain by the age of 21. But success came with a price that nobody had warned her about. The pressure to maintain her wild, carefree image on screen began bleeding into her real life, and cigarettes became her constant companion through 16-hour filming days and sleepless nights, filled with parties she couldn't escape. Clara's smoking wasn't just a habit, it was performance art. She would light a cigarette with the same theatrical flair she brought to her film roles, holding it between perfectly manicured fingers while she delivered devastating one-liners to reporters. But behind the glamorous facade, Clara was chain-smoking through anxiety attacks and using nicotine to suppress her appetite because the studios demanded she maintain an impossible figure. What made Clara's story even more tragic was how the media turned her smoking into part of her brand. Magazine articles described her as dangerously modern and thrillingly rebellious, but they failed to mention that she was smoking 3 packs a day by 1925. The same newspapers that celebrated her independence were unknowingly documenting her descent into addiction, and Clara was too young and too isolated to recognize what was happening to her. But Clara wasn't alone in her struggle. Across town, another young actress was discovering that cigarettes could be both salvation and destruction. Pola Negri, the Polish-born silent film star, had brought European sophistication to Hollywood's rough edges. Pola smoked with an elegance that made other actresses look like amateurs, but her relationship with cigarettes was far more complex than her graceful exterior suggested. Pola had started smoking as a teenager in Poland, where cigarettes were considered sophisticated and worldly. When she arrived in Hollywood in 1922, her smoking became part of her exotic appeal. Directors would specifically write scenes that showcased her ability to smoke dramatically, and photographers would capture her in a cloud of elegantly exhaled smoke. But what audiences didn't see was how Pola used cigarettes to cope with the loneliness of being a foreign actress in an American industry that exoticized her while keeping her at arm's length. The pressure on Pola was different from what Clara faced, but no less intense. As one of the few European stars in Hollywood, she felt obligated to maintain an air of mysterious sophistication at all times. Cigarettes became her prop, her security blanket, and eventually her crutch. She would smoke to calm her nerves before interviews, to steady her hands during difficult emotional scenes, and to fill the silence during the long, lonely hours between takes. What's particularly heartbreaking about Pola's story is how she tried to quit multiple times, only to be encouraged by directors and producers to continue smoking because it was so integral to her screen persona. The industry that had made her famous was literally invested in keeping her addicted, and Pola found herself trapped between her desire for health and her need to maintain her career. Meanwhile, in the emerging world of Hollywood parties and premieres, cigarettes were becoming the ultimate social currency. These weren't just casual gatherings, they were carefully orchestrated events where careers were made and destroyed over cocktails and small talk. And at the center of it all were women like Marion Davies, the actress and mistress of media mogul William Randolph Hearst, who turned smoking into a social art form. Marion's relationship with cigarettes was inextricably linked to her relationship with power. As Hearst's companion, she had access to the highest levels of Hollywood society, but she also faced constant scrutiny and judgment. Smoking became her way of asserting independence in a relationship where she had very little control over her own life. She would light cigarettes during business meetings to signal that she was an equal participant, not just decorative arm candy. But Marion's smoking also served another purpose. It was her way of bonding with other actresses who were similarly trapped in the Hollywood machine. In the ladies' rooms of exclusive clubs and in the quiet corners of studio lots, women like Marion would share cigarettes and secrets, creating an underground network of support that helped them survive in an industry designed to consume them. The irony wasn't lost on these. They were literally women that consuming something that would consume them in return. But in the 1920s, the health risks of unknown and even smoking were largely, if they had been widely publicized. It's unlikely these women would have had many alternatives for coping with the unique pressures they faced. What's crucial to understand is that these women's relationships with cigarettes existed within a larger context of rebellion and restriction. The 1920s were a time of unprecedented social change, particularly for women. The 19th Amendment, the right to vote. Fashion had given them more liber was becoming, and attitudes, sexuality, ating toward female were slowly evolving. But Hollywood women face unique paradox. They were expected to embody this new modern femininity on screen, while still conforming to traditional expectations of feminine behavior off-screen. Cigarettes became the perfect symbol of this contradiction. They were rebellious enough to signal independence and modernity, but subtle enough not to completely scandalize conservative audiences. A woman could smoke and still be considered respectable, as long as she did it with the right kind of elegance and restraint. This delicate balance is perfectly illustrated in the career of Gloria Swanson, perhaps the most famous smoker of her era. Gloria didn't just smoke, she made smoking look like the cigarette height of sophistication. Her holders became iconic, and her ability to deliver dramatic lines while managing a cigarette became legendary among her peers. But Gloria's smoking was also deeply practical. She used cigarettes to control her weight, to calm her nerves, and to create pauses in conversations that allowed her to think before speaking. Gloria understood better than most that in Hollywood, image was everything, and cigarettes were an essential part of the image she had crafted for herself. She was photographed smoking in elegant towns, in G-casual sportswear, and in elaborate stage costumes. Each photograph reinforced her reputation as a modern, independent woman who lived life on her own terms. But like so many of her contemporaries, Gloria's public confidence masked private struggles. She was smoking to cope with the pressure of maintaining her status as Hollywood's highest-paid actress, the stress of managing multiple business ventures, and the loneliness that came with being constantly in the public eye. What started as a sophisticated affectation gradually became a necessity, and Gloria found herself unable to face the demands of her career without the calming ritual of lighting and smoking cigarettes. The transformation of cigarettes from luxury items to daily necessities tells us everything we need to know about what these women were really experiencing behind the glamour and success. In just a few short years, Hollywood had created a culture where addiction was not only normalized, but celebrated, where self-destructive behavior was repackaged as rebellion, and where women's genuine struggles for independence were commodified and sold back to them as entertainment. The studios themselves played a fascinating and disturbing role in perpetuating these addictions. While publicly maintaining wholesome images for their stars, behind closed doors, they were actively encouraging behaviors that kept their actresses dependent and controllable. Studio executives discovered that a slightly addicted actress was often a more compliant actress. Women who needed their cigarette breaks were less likely to make demands about working conditions, less likely to walk off sets, and more likely to accept whatever roles were offered to them. This manipulation reached its peak with actresses like Louise Brooks, the bob-haired beauty who would later become synonymous with 1920s rebellion. Louise arrived in Hollywood from Kansas with dreams of dancing, but quickly found herself typecast as the quintessential flapper. The studios loved her natural rebelliousness, but they also needed to control it, and cigarettes became one of their most effective tools. Louise was introduced to smoking by a studio publicity manager who convinced her that cigarettes would help her maintain the razor-thin figure that cameras demanded. What he didn't mention was that the studios had deals with tobacco companies to feature their products in films, and actresses who smoked on and off camera were valuable advertising assets. Louise found herself trapped in a web of commercial interests that extended far beyond her own personal choices. The psychological manipulation went even deeper. Studio heads would deliberately schedule the most stressful meetings and contract negotiations during times when they knew their actresses would be craving nicotine. They would remove ashtrays from waiting rooms to increase anxiety, then offer cigarettes as a gesture of kindness and support. These calculated power games turned addiction into a weapon that could be used to control some of the most powerful women in America. Louise later described feeling like she was living in a beautiful prison where her jailers offered her cigarettes through the bars. She was making more money than she had ever imagined possible, wearing clothes that cost more than most people's houses, and attending parties with the most famous people in the world. But she was also smoking 2 packs a day and waking up each morning with a cough that reminded her that something was very wrong with her life. The tragic irony was that these women had come to Hollywood seeking freedom and independence, only to find themselves more controlled than they had ever been in their small-town lives. Cigarettes, which had initially represented rebellion and sophistication, became symbols of their captivity. They were smoking to cope with the very system that had taught them to smoke in the first place. But perhaps no story illustrates this vicious cycle better than that of Theda Bara, the actress who created the archetype of the screen vamp. Theda had built her entire career on being dangerous, mysterious, and slightly wicked. Her publicity materials claimed she was an exotic Egyptian actress whose very presence could drive men to madness. In reality, She was Theodosia Goodman from Cincinnati, Ohio, and she was desperately trying to maintain an impossible persona. Theda's smoking was central to her vamp image. She would pose for publicity photographs with cigarettes dangling from ruby red lips, surrounded by veils of smoke that added to her air of mystery. Audiences loved the idea that she was too dangerous to be wholesome, too sophisticated to be innocent. But maintaining this image required Theda to smoke constantly, both on and off camera, until the line between performance and reality completely disappeared. The pressure on Theda was extraordinary because her entire career depended on convincing the public that she really was the dangerous woman she played on screen. She couldn't be photographed looking wholesome or domestic because it would shatter the illusion that made her valuable to the studios. So she smoked at breakfast, at lunch, at dinner, and during every public appearance. She smoked when she was happy, when she was sad, when she was bored, and when she was terrified. What makes Theda's story particularly heartbreaking is that she was fully aware of what was happening to her. In private letters to her family, she wrote about feeling like she was disappearing inside the character she had created. She described smoking as both her lifeline and her prison, the thing that kept her employable and the thing that was slowly killing her spirit. But she also knew that admitting her struggles publicly would end her career, so she continued performing the dangerous vamp-even role of the when the cameras stopped rolling. The social dynamics surrounding women's smoking habits, these revealed just how complex and contradictory the 1920s really were. While society was supposedly becoming more liberal and accepting of women's independence, the reality was far more nuanced. Women could smoke, but only in the right way, at attitude the right times, and with the right. Step too far outside these unspoken boundaries, and the same society that celebrated your rebellion would turn against you with vicious speed. This double standard was perfectly embodied in the career of Mae Murray, the platinum blonde dancer who became one of the biggest stars of the mid-1920s. Mae had perfected the art of smoking elegantly, and her cigarette holders became as famous as her elaborate costumes. She understood that smoking was part of her appeal, but she also understood that it had to be done with a certain feminine grace that never challenged male authority too directly. Mae's smoking rituals were elaborate performances in themselves. She would select her cigarettes with the same care she used to choose her jewelry, lighting them with gold-plated lighters and holding them at precisely the right angle to photograph beautifully. Every gesture was calculated to maintain her image as simultaneously modern and feminine, independent but not threatening. But behind this carefully crafted performance, Mae was struggling with the same pressures that plagued all of her contemporaries. She was smoking to control her weight because the camera added pounds that could end careers. She was smoking to calm her nerves before difficult dance sequences that could result in injury if performed incorrectly. She was smoking to fill the empty hours between takes when she had nothing to do but worry about whether her career would survive the rapidly changing tastes of Hollywood audiences. The most insidious aspect of Mae's relationship with cigarettes was how it became entangled with her romantic relationships. She discovered that smoking created an immediate intimacy with men who were also smokers, and she began using cigarettes as tools of seduction and manipulation. She would offer cigarettes to directors she wanted to impress, share intimate smoking moments with co-stars to build on-screen chemistry, and use the ritual of lighting and sharing cigarettes to create bonds that could advance her career. But this strategy backfired when Mae realized that the men in her life were also using cigarettes to control her. Boyfriends would withhold cigarettes during arguments. Producers would schedule smoke breaks to interrupt conversations Mae didn't want to have. And studio executives would comment on her smoking habits as a way of reminding her that they were always watching and judging her behavior. The paranoia that developed around these power dynamics was perhaps the most toxic aspect of Hollywood's smoking culture. Women became convinced that everyone was analyzing their smoking habits for signs of weakness, desperation, or loss of control. They began smoking defensively, using cigarettes as shields against criticism and judgment, which only deepened their dependence and isolation. This psychological warfare reached its peak during the infamous parties thrown by studio moguls like Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. These events were supposed to be celebrations, but they were actually elaborate tests where every gesture, every conversation, and every cigarette was scrutinized for its potential impact on careers and reputations. Women would arrive at these parties already smoking to calm their nerves, then continue smoking throughout the evening as they navigated the complex social and professional dynamics that could make or break their futures. The atmosphere at these gatherings was electric with tension and possibility. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like fog, creating an otherworldly environment where deals were made, hearts were broken, and addictions were fed. Women would huddle in corners, sharing cigarettes and secrets, forming temporary alliances that might protect them for a few hours, but would dissolve as soon as the party ended and everyone returned to competing for the same limited opportunities. What's particularly striking about these parties is how they created a false sense of camaraderie among women who were actually rivals. Sharing cigarettes became a way of pretending that they were all friends, all in the same boat, all supporting each other through the challenges of Hollywood life. But underneath this performance of solidarity was the reality that each woman was fighting for survival in an industry that had no loyalty and no mercy for those who couldn't keep up with its demands. The tragedy of these manufactured friendships becomes crystal clear when we examine what happened to Joan Crawford, though she wouldn't adopt that name until 1925. At this point was still in her career, she Lucille Le Sueur from San Antonio, Texas, desperately trying to fit into a world that seemed designed to exclude her. Lucille had none of the natural elegance of her contemporaries, none of the breeding or sophistication that Hollywood seemed to value. What she did have was an almost frightening determination to succeed, and she quickly learned that cigarettes could level the playing field in ways that talent alone could not. Lucille's first cigarette was handed to her by Norma Talmadge at one of those infamous studio parties. Norma was already an established star, the kind of woman who could make or break a newcomer's career with a single comment. When she offered Lucille that cigarette, it wasn't just tobacco she was offering. It was acceptance, inclusion, and the promise of belonging to Hollywood's inner circle. Lucille took the cigarette with trembling fingers and tried not to cough as she inhaled her first taste of what she thought was freedom. Within months, Lucille was smoking constantly. She smoked while learning her lines, while waiting for costume fittings, while sitting alone in her tiny apartment, wondering if she would ever make it in this impossible town. But she also discovered that cigarettes gave her something she had never possessed before, a sense of sophistication that couldn't be taught or inherited. When she held a cigarette, she felt like she belonged in the same room as women who'd been born into privilege and beauty. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Lucille's smoking style evolved from nervous puffing to confident performance art. She learned to use cigarettes to punctuate her conversations, to create dramatic pauses, and to signal her emotions without saying a word. Directors began to notice that she looked more comfortable on camera when she was smoking, more natural and relaxed. Soon, they were writing cigarettes into her scenes, and Lucille found herself becoming the kind of actress who was known as much for how she smoked as for how she acted. But this success came with a price that Lucille hadn't anticipated. As her dependence on cigarettes grew, so did her dependence on the approval of others. She found herself smoking more heavily before meetings with producers, before auditions, before any situation where her future might be determined by someone else's opinion of her worth. The cigarettes that had initially given her confidence were now necessary just to function, and the line between performance and survival had completely disappeared. The studios recognized this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. Producers would deliberately schedule important meetings early in the morning when they knew actresses would be craving their first cigarette of the day. They would conduct these meetings in non-smoking environments, watching as women like Lucille became increasingly agitated and desperate. Then, at the crucial moment when contracts were being discussed or demands were being made, they would graciously offer a cigarette break, positioning themselves as benevolent father figures who understood and cared about their stars' needs. This psychological manipulation was so effective that many actresses never recognized it for what it was. They genuinely believed that their studio executives cared about their well-being, that the cigarettes offered during stressful negotiations were gestures of kindness rather than calculated power moves. The addiction created a dependency that went far beyond nicotine. These women became psychologically dependent on the very system that was exploiting them, grateful for small mercies that were actually designed to keep them controllable and compliant. The most disturbing aspect of this dynamic was how it played out in the relationships between established stars and newcomers. Women like Norma Talmadge, who had survived long enough to gain some power in the system, found themselves perpetuating the same patterns of manipulation that had been used against them. They would offer cigarettes to young actresses, not out of genuine friendship, but as a way of maintaining their own position in Hollywood's rigid hierarchy. This created a vicious cycle where each generation of actresses passed their addictions and insecurities down to the next, never quite understanding how they had become both victims and perpetrators of the same destructive system. The cigarettes that circulated at those glamorous parties weren't just tobacco products. They were instruments of social control, markers of status, and symbols of a power structure that kept everyone trapped in their designated roles. The health consequences of this widespread smoking were already beginning to manifest by the mid-1920s, though they were rarely discussed publicly. Actresses would develop persistent coughs that they covered with increasingly elaborate makeup techniques. They would lose their voices during filming and blame it on the dry California air rather than acknowledging their smoking habits. Most tellingly, they would become increasingly dependent on cigarettes to maintain their energy levels and suppress their appetites, creating a dangerous cycle of stimulation and starvation that wreaked havoc on their bodies. Colleen Moore, the actress who would later claim to have invented the bob haircut, was among the first to recognize the physical toll that smoking was taking on her peers. Colleen had started smoking like everyone else, as a way of fitting in and appearing sophisticated. But she was also naturally observant, and she began to notice patterns that others were to see. Up in their own struggles too, she watched as actresses who had been vibrant and energetic just a few years earlier became increasingly frail and nervous. She saw how cigarettes that had once been occasional indulgences became constant necessities. Most alarmingly, she observed how the women around her were losing their ability to cope with stress without smoking, becoming increasingly agitated and unstable when they were deprived of nicotine for even short periods. Colleen tried to discuss these concerns with her friends, but she quickly discovered that any criticism of smoking was viewed as an attack on the independence and sophistication that these women had fought so hard to achieve. Cigarettes had become so central to their identities as modern, liberated women that questioning their smoking habits felt like questioning their right to make their own choices. The very thing that was destroying them had become inextricably linked to their sense of self-worth and autonomy. This defensive attitude reveals just how completely cigarettes had infiltrated the psychology of 1920s Hollywood. These weren't just physical addictions, they were emotional and social dependencies that touched every aspect of these women's lives. Cigarettes had become the thread that wove together their professional success, their social acceptance, their romantic relationships, and their personal identity. Pulling on that thread threatened to unravel everything they had built for themselves in this precarious new world. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many of these women were incredibly intelligent and perceptive. They weren't naive victims who stumbled unknowingly into addiction. They were smart, ambitious women who understood exactly what was happening to them, but felt powerless to change course without sacrificing everything they had worked to achieve. They were trapped between their desire for health and their need for success, between their personal well-being and their professional survival. This impossible choice became even more complex when we consider the racial and class dynamics that shaped Hollywood's smoking culture. Women of color, who were already marginalized within the industry, found that smoking could provide a small measure of social currency that might otherwise be denied to them. But they also faced additional scrutiny and judgment that made their relationship with cigarettes even more fraught and complicated. Anna May Wong, the Chinese-American actress who would become one of the first Asian-American movie stars, navigated these treacherous waters with remarkable skill and devastating personal cost. Anna May understood that her exotic appearance was both her greatest asset and her biggest liability in Hollywood. She was typecast in roles that played into Western stereotypes about Asian women, but she was also excluded from leading roles that might have allowed her to display her full range as an actress. Smoking became one of the few ways Anna May could assert some control over her image and her career. When she smoked, she looked sophisticated and worldly rather than foreign and different. When she held a cigarette, she commanded attention and respect in rooms where her race might otherwise make her invisible. The ritual of lighting and smoking gave her something to do with her hands during the uncomfortable silences that often greeted her presence at industry events. But Anna May's smoking also made her a target for criticism from both white and Asian communities. Conservative white audiences saw her smoking as confirmation of their prejudices about the moral character of Asian women. Meanwhile, members of the Chinese-American community criticized her for perpetuating negative stereotypes and failing to represent their culture with appropriate dignity and restraint. This double bind meant that Anna May's smoking carried risks and consequences that her white contemporaries never had to consider. She was simultaneously too foreign for mainstream acceptance and too Americanized for approval from her own community. Cigarettes became both her shield against these conflicting pressures and the thing that made her more vulnerable to attack from all sides. The psychological toll of navigating these impossible expectations while maintaining a public career was enormous. Anna May smoked to calm her nerves before facing hostile audiences, to steady her hands before signing contracts that limited her to stereotypical roles, and to fill the lonely hours in hotel rooms where she was often the only person of color for miles around. Her addiction became inextricably linked to the isolation and discrimination that shaped every aspect of her professional life. Similar dynamics played out for actresses from working-class backgrounds who found themselves thrust into Hollywood's upper-class social circles. Women like Marie Prevost, who had started as a bathing beauty in Mack Sennett comedies, discovered that smoking could help them navigate social situations where their lack of breeding and education might otherwise be exposed. But they also found themselves caught between their authentic selves and the sophisticated personas they needed to maintain for their careers. Marie had grown up in poverty in Ontario, Canada, and had worked as a secretary before stumbling into film work almost by accident. She possessed natural comedic timing and genuine charm, but she lacked the cultural knowledge and social graces that seemed to come naturally to actresses from more privileged backgrounds. When she arrived at Hollywood parties, she felt like an imposter surrounded by women who spoke languages she didn't understand and referenced experiences she had never had. Cigarettes became Marie's social crutch, giving her something to do during awkward conversational lulls and providing an excuse to step away from situations where she felt out of her depth. She learned to smoke with the same elegant gestures she had observed in more sophisticated actresses. But the anxiety underlying her performance never completely disappeared. She was constantly afraid that someone would see through her carefully constructed facade and reveal her as the working-class girl-any was that Marie's authentic. She really was. The ericity and relatability were precisely what made her appealing to audiences. Her comedic roles worked because she brought genuine warmth and humanity to characters that could have been mere stereotypes. But the Hollywood system convinced her that these qualities were liabilities rather than assets, that she needed to hide her true self behind a cloud of cigarette smoke and affected sophistication. This systematic destruction of authenticity was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Hollywood's smoking culture. The industry took women who were naturally charming, talented, and appealing, then convinced them that they needed to transform themselves into something else entirely. Cigarettes became the symbol and instrument of this transformation, the thing that allowed them to become the people they thought they needed to be to succeed. The process was so gradual and so seemingly voluntary that most actresses never recognized how completely they had been manipulated. They genuinely believed that they were making free choices about their smoking habits, their social behaviors, and their professional personas. They couldn't see how every aspect of their environment had been carefully designed to push them toward dependence and compliance. The studios reinforced these patterns through carefully orchestrated publicity campaigns that celebrated their stars' smoking habits while simultaneously using those habits to control their behavior. Photographers would capture actresses in glamorous smoking poses that suggested sophistication and rebellion, but these same photographs would be used as evidence against the women if they ever stepped too far out of line or demanded too much independence. This double-edged sword was perfectly illustrated in the career of Lila Lee, the dark-haired beauty who specialized in playing innocent heroines with hidden depths. Lila's smoking was featured prominently in magazine spreads that portrayed her as a modern, independent woman who lived life on her own terms. The same magazines published articles praising her sophistication and worldliness, using her smoking habits as evidence of her liberated attitude toward life and love. But when Lila began demanding better roles and higher pay, those same smoking photographs were suddenly reframed as evidence of moral weakness and poor judgment. Studio executives who had previously celebrated her independence now used her smoking as justification for keeping her in subordinate roles, arguing that audiences wouldn't accept a smoker as a pure, innocent heroine. The speed with which the narrative around Lila's smoking changed revealed the true nature of Hollywood's relationship with its female stars. Their rebellions and independence were only celebrated as long as they remained profitable and controllable. The moment they threatened the existing power structure, their smoking habits became weapons that could be used against them, evidence of character flaws that justified their professional punishment. This cynical manipulation of public perception was made possible by the broader cultural ambivalence surrounding women's smoking in the 1920s. Society was simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by the image of the smoking woman, attracted to her apparent independence while remaining suspicious of her moral character. Hollywood exploited this contradiction brilliantly, using it to create compelling screen personas while maintaining ultimate control over the women who embodied them. The psychological damage inflicted by this system was profound and lasting. Actresses learned to see themselves through the lens of public perception, constantly analyzing their own behavior for its potential impact on their careers and reputations. They became unable to distinguish between their authentic desires and the personas they had created for public consumption, losing touch with the very selves they had come to Hollywood to express and develop. The cigarettes that had initially promised freedom and sophistication became prison bars, beautiful and seductive, but ultimately confining. Every puff was both an act of rebellion and an act of submission, a declaration of independence that simultaneously reinforced their dependence on the very system they thought they were defying. The smoke that surrounded these women was more than just tobacco fumes. It was the visible manifestation of their dreams turning to ash, their authentic selves disappearing behind carefully crafted illusions that became more real than reality itself. The insidious nature of this manipulation becomes even clearer when we examine the rise of Barbara Lamar, a woman whose entire existence seemed designed to embody every dangerous fantasy that 1920s America had about modern womanhood. Barbara didn't just smoke cigarettes. She consumed them with the same voracious appetite she brought to everything else in her short, incandescent life. Born Reatha Dale Watson in Richmond, Virginia, she had reinvented herself so many times by the time she reached Hollywood that even she seemed unsure where the performance ended and the real woman began. Barbara's smoking was theatrical from the very beginning, but it served a darker purpose than mere performance. She had discovered that cigarettes could be used as props in a much larger game of seduction and manipulation that extended far beyond the movie screen. At parties, she would position herself in pools of lamplight where the smoke from her cigarettes would create dramatic silhouettes, transforming every casual conversation into a scene from one of her films. But Barbara's relationship with cigarettes was complicated by her addiction to a far more dangerous substance: the attention and adoration of men. She collected admirers the way other women collected jewelry, and cigarettes became essential tools in this elaborate hunting ritual. She would offer cigarettes to men she wanted to ensnare, sharing intimate lighting moments that created instant psychological bonds. She would withhold cigarettes from lovers who had disappointed her, using their own smoking habits as instruments of emotional torture. The power dynamics at play in Barbara's relationships reveal how cigarettes had become woven into the very fabric of romantic and sexual interaction in 1920s Hollywood. Men and women used smoking as a form of non-verbal communication, signaling everything from sexual interest to social status to emotional availability. A shared cigarette could mean the beginning of an affair or the end of a marriage, depending on who was watching and what they chose to make of the gesture. Barbara understood these unspoken rules better than most, and she exploited them ruthlessly. She would smoke differently depending on which man she was trying to attract, adopting the smoking style that would most appeal to his particular psychology. With intellectual types, she would smoke contemplatively, using cigarettes to punctuate philosophical discussions. With dangerous men, she would smoke recklessly, flicking ashes carelessly and letting smoke escape from her lips in ways that suggested barely controlled passion. This constant performance was exhausting, and Barbara began smoking not just for effect, but for survival. The cigarettes that had once been props in her seduction games became necessary fuel for maintaining the energy required to manipulate so many different relationships simultaneously. She was smoking to stay alert during late-night rendezvous, to calm her nerves before difficult conversations with jealous lovers, and to suppress the appetite that might interfere with her ability to maintain the perfect figure that made her so irresistible. The tragedy of Barbara's story is that she was so successful at becoming what men wanted her to be that she lost all sense of what she actually wanted for herself. Her smoking habits changed depending on which lover was currently dominating her life, and she found herself unable to light a cigarette without thinking about how the gesture would be perceived and interpreted by the men around her. Even in her most private moments, she was performing for an imaginary audience that had become more real to her than her own authentic desires. This psychological fragmentation was accelerated by the demands of her film career, which required her to embody different aspects of dangerous femininity for different audiences. In one film, she would play a sophisticated European temptress who smoked with continental elegance. In another, she would portray a wild American flapper whose cigarettes were symbols of reckless abandon. Each role required her to master a different smoking style, a different way of holding her body, a different relationship with the cigarettes that had become extensions of her personality. The lines between these various personas became increasingly blurred as Barbara's addiction deepened. She would find herself smoking like her most recent character, even when the cameras weren't rolling, unconsciously adopting mannerisms and gestures that belonged to fictional women rather than her authentic self. Her friends began to comment that they never knew which version of Barbara they would encounter at any given moment, and Barbara herself seemed equally uncertain about which performance was currently required. This identity crisis was compounded by the physical toll that her excessive smoking was beginning to take on her appearance and health. Barbara was smoking 4 packs a day by 1924, and the constant nicotine intake was affecting her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to concentrate during filming. She began using cigarettes to wake herself up in the morning and to wind herself down at night, creating a cycle of artificial stimulation and sedation that left her increasingly disconnected from her natural rhythms and instincts. The studios initially ignored these warning signs because Barbara's self-destructive tendencies were profitable. Audiences were fascinated by her apparent willingness to live dangerously, and her smoking habits were featured prominently in publicity materials that promised viewers a glimpse into the wild lifestyle of Hollywood's most notorious temptress. The more recklessly Barbara smoked, the more valuable she became as a symbol of everything thrilling and forbidden about modern womanhood. But this exploitation came with a price that extended far beyond Barbara's personal well-being. Her highly publicized smoking habits were influencing countless young women across America who saw her as a role model for liberated femininity. Department stores began selling Barbara Lamar cigarette holders to women who wanted to emulate her sophisticated smoking style. Fashion magazines featured articles on smoking elegantly that used Barbara's techniques as examples of proper feminine deportment. This cultural influence was both intoxicating and terrifying for Barbara, who had never intended to become a spokesperson for women's smoking habits. She began to feel responsible for the choices being made by women she had never met, women who were copying her gestures without understanding the desperation and addiction that motivated them. The weight of this unintended influence added another layer of pressure to Barbara's already fragmented psyche, and she found herself smoking even more heavily to cope with the guilt and anxiety that accompanied her newfound status as a cultural icon. The irony was that Barbara's most devoted imitators were often young women from conservative backgrounds who saw smoking as their ticket to the kind of sophistication and worldliness that Barbara seemed to embody effortlessly. These women would practice Barbara's smoking techniques in their bedroom mirrors, unaware that Barbara herself was practicing different versions of femininity with the same desperate intensity. They were copying a performance of confidence and control from a woman who was rapidly losing both. Meanwhile, the other actresses in Hollywood were watching Barbara's meteoric rise with a mixture of admiration and horror. They could see the toll that her lifestyle was taking on her health and sanity, but they also couldn't ignore the professional success that seemed to accompany her self-destructive behavior. Barbara was commanding higher salaries than almost any other actress in Hollywood, and her films were breaking box office records across the country. This created a perverse incentive structure, where Barbara's addiction and instability were actually making her more valuable to the industry that was simultaneously destroying her. The studios began looking for other actresses who could replicate Barbara's dangerous appeal, and they started encouraging their contract players to adopt more reckless smoking habits and more chaotic personal lives. The message was clear: self-destruction could be profitable, as long as it was the right kind of self-destruction performed with the right kind of style. Estelle Taylor, the brunette beauty who would later marry heavyweight boxing champion Jack Dempsey, found herself caught in this impossible bind. Estelle had originally come to Hollywood with dreams of playing serious dramatic roles, but the success of Barbara Lamar had convinced studio executives that audiences wanted dangerous women who lived on the edge of disaster. Estelle was pressured to adopt a more reckless persona, and cigarettes became central to this transformation. Estelle's natural smoking style was elegant and restrained, befitting her middle-class upbringing and classical theatrical training. But the studios wanted something more dramatic, barely controlled passion and gestive of more sugged potential self-destruction. Estelle found herself taking smoking lessons from publicity coaches who taught her to smoke with the kind of theatrical intensity that would photograph well and generate the right kind of scandalous publicity. The absurdity of this situation wasn't lost on Estelle, who was essentially being trained to perform addiction for the entertainment of audiences who had no idea they were watching a carefully choreographed act. She was learning to hold cigarettes in ways that suggested desperation, to inhale with the kind of deep, hungry breaths that implied emotional instability, and to exhale smoke in clouds that would create dramatic visual effects for photographers and cinematographers. But the performance began to affect the performer in ways that nobody had anticipated. Estelle discovered that smoking with such intensity actually required her to smoke more heavily than her natural habits would have dictated. The exaggerated gestures and deep inhalations that looked so dramatic on screen were creating a genuine physical dependence that went far beyond her original casual smoking habits. She was becoming actually addicted while pretending to be addicted, trapped in a feedback loop that made it impossible to distinguish between performance and reality. The psychological pressure was enormous because Estelle knew that her career depended on maintaining this performance of dangerous femininity. But she also knew that the performance was slowly destroying her ability to access her authentic self. She was smoking to cope with the anxiety of constantly performing, but the smoking was also an essential part of the performance she was trying to maintain. There was no escape from the cycle, no way to step back and evaluate what was happening without risking everything she had worked to achieve. This catch-22 was experienced by dozens of actresses who found themselves trapped between their desire for authentic self-expression and their need to conform to Hollywood's increasingly narrow definitions of marketable femininity. The women who had come to Los Angeles seeking creative freedom found themselves more constrained than they had ever been in their previous lives, forced to perform versions of liberation that were actually forms of captivity. The situation was made even more complex by the emergence of competing smoking styles that reflected different aspects of 1920s femininity. While Barbara Lamar represented dangerous, sexually aggressive smoking, other actresses were developing alternative approaches that appealed to different audience demographics. Colleen Moore perfected the innocent flapper smoking style that suggested youthful rebellion without threatening moral boundaries. Gloria Swanson embodied sophisticated European smoking that implied worldliness without suggesting moral corruption. Each of these smoking styles required different techniques, different props, and different psychological approaches. Actresses found themselves specializing in particular smoking personas, the same way they specialized in particular types of film roles. And many discovered that changing their smoking style was as difficult as changing their screen image. The cigarettes that had initially seemed like simple props had become fundamental aspects of their professional identities, as important to their marketability as their acting ability or physical appearance. This specialization created a bizarre form of competition where actresses were essentially competing to see who could smoke most effectively for their particular market niche. Magazine articles began comparing different stars' smoking techniques, ants, their sophistication, and rating their ability to make smoking look appealing to their target audiences. Photographers specialized in capturing different types of smoking poses, and studios began hiring smoking coaches to help their contract players develop more distinctive and marketable smoking personas. The commercialization of these women's addictions reached its peak with the emergence of cigarette endorsement deals that paid actresses substantial sums to publicly promote particular tobacco brands. These endorsements were presented as evidence of the actress's sophisticated taste and discerning judgment, but they were actually contracts that required the women to smoke specific brands in public and to make positive statements about the quality and appeal of particular cigarettes. Norma Shearer, the Canadian-born actress who would later become one of MGM's biggest stars, found herself bound by one of these endorsement contracts that required her to smoke a particular brand of cigarettes at all public appearances. The contract specified not just which cigarettes she had to smoke, but how she had to smoke them, what she could say about them, and even how many she had to consume during photographed events. This level of control over such an intimate aspect of personal behavior represented a new form of corporate exploitation that went far beyond traditional employment relationships. Norma wasn't just selling her acting ability to the studios. She was selling her body's responses to addictive substances, her personal habits, and her private moments of relaxation and stress relief. The cigarette companies were literally purchasing her addiction and using it as a marketing tool to convince other women to develop similar dependencies. The psychological impact of this commercialization was devastating because it made it impossible for these women to maintain any authentic relationship with their own smoking habits. Every cigarette became a performance. Every moment of smoking became a potential publicity opportunity, and every private moment of addiction became a commodity that could be packaged and sold to audiences who had no understanding of the real costs involved. Norma later described feeling like she was living inside an advertisement for cigarettes, unable to smoke for her own pleasure or relief without thinking about how the gesture would be perceived by potential consumers of the product she was being paid to promote. Her addiction had become so thoroughly commercialized that she couldn't access the simple human comfort that cigarettes might have provided, because every aspect of her smoking had been transformed into a marketing message. The broader cultural implications of this commercialization were staggering because it meant that the smoking habits being promoted to American women were not authentic expressions of liberation or sophistication, but carefully crafted marketing campaigns designed to create new consumer markets for tobacco products. The rebellion and independence that cigarettes seemed to represent were actually manufactured illusions created by advertising executives who understood that women's desire for freedom could be exploited and monetized. This revelation would have been shocking to the millions of American women who were modeling their smoking habits on the actresses they admired, unaware that they were copying advertising performances rather than authentic expressions of modern femininity. The sophisticated smoking styles they were emulating had been designed by marketing teams rather than developed naturally by independent women making their own choices about how to live their lives. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many of the actresses involved in these endorsement deals were themselves unaware of how completely their authentic impulses had been co-opted by commercial interests. They genuinely believed that they were making independent choices about which cigarettes to smoke and how to smoke them, not realizing that their preferences had been shaped by financial incentives and contractual obligations that made genuine choice impossible. This manufactured authenticity became the foundation for a smoking culture that would influence American women for decades to come, creating patterns of addiction and behavior that were based on commercial manipulation rather than genuine personal expression. The women of 1920s Hollywood thought they were pioneering new forms of feminine independence, but they were actually serving as unwitting test subjects in a vast marketing experiment that would have consequences far beyond anything they could have imagined. The most chilling aspect of this experiment was how successfully it convinced its subjects that they were willing participants rather than victims of manipulation. The actresses who were most thoroughly controlled by the system were often the ones who felt most empowered by their smoking habits, most convinced that they were expressing their authentic selves through their cigarette choices and smoking styles. This psychological manipulation was so effective that it would take decades for anyone to recognize the true scope of what had happened during those crucial years when cigarettes became symbols of women's liberation. The women who lived through this transformation would carry its effects for the rest of their lives, never fully understanding how their most intimate habits had been shaped by forces that had nothing to do with their own desires or authentic needs. The web of deception grew even more intricate when we examine the rise of Pola Negri's greatest rival, a woman who would become the embodiment of everything dangerous and alluring about cigarette culture in 1920s Hollywood. Greta Garbo arrived from Sweden in 1925 with virtually no English and an almost mystical understanding of how cigarettes could be transformed into instruments of psychological warfare. Unlike her American contemporaries, who had stumbled into smoking through social pressure and studio manipulation, Greta approached cigarettes with the calculated precision of a chess master planning a long-term strategy. Greta's smoking was different from anything Hollywood had seen before. Where other actresses used cigarettes as props or social lubricants, Greta wielded them like surgical instruments, capable of disconversation acting a relationship with a single perfectly timed gesture. She would light a cigarette during contract negotiations and used the flame to illuminate her face in ways that made her seem both vulnerable and dangerous. She would exhale smoke during romantic scenes with a languorous intensity that made audiences forget they were watching a performance rather than witnessing genuine seduction. But what made Greta's smoking truly revolutionary was how she used it to maintain control over her own image in an industry designed to strip actresses of all personal agency. While other stars were being molded and manipulated by studio executives, Greta created an aura of mystery around her smoking habits that made her simultaneously more valuable and more untouchable. She would smoke different brands depending on her mood, her co-stars, and the message she wanted to send to the press and public. This strategic approach to smoking allowed Greta to negotiate from a position of strength that was unprecedented for foreign actresses in Hollywood. Studio heads who were accustomed to controlling every aspect of their stars' lives found themselves unable to predict or manipulate Greta's behavior because her smoking habits were so closely tied to her psychological state and creative process. When she was happy with a role, she would smoke elegantly and sparingly. When she was dissatisfied with her treatment, she would chain smoke with an intensity that made everyone around her uncomfortable. The power dynamics that emerged around Greta's smoking habits revealed just how thoroughly cigarettes had become integrated into Hollywood's complex social and professional hierarchies. Directors learned to read her smoking patterns as indicators of her willingness to cooperate with their creative vision. Producers began timing their requests and demands to coincide with moments when her smoking suggested she might be more receptive to negotiation. Even her fellow actresses found themselves analyzing Greta's cigarette choices for clues about her mood and intentions. This transformation of smoking from personal habit to strategic communication tool represented a new level of sophistication in Hollywood's manipulation of addiction for professional purposes. But it also created a dangerous precedent that would influence the behavior of countless actresses who tried to emulate Greta's success without understanding the psychological costs involved in maintaining such elaborate performances. Marlene Dietrich, the German actress who would later become Greta's most formidable competitor, learned these lessons firsthand when she attempted to replicate Greta's mysterious smoking style for her own career advancement. Marlene had been smoking since her teenage years in Berlin, but her natural approach was straightforward and unpretentious. When she arrived in Hollywood, she was advised by publicity agents to develop a more theatrical smoking persona that would distinguish her from the dozens of other European actresses trying to establish themselves in American films. Marlene's transformation from casual smoker to cigarette artist was both fascinating and heartbreaking to witness. She spent hours practicing different ways of holding cigarettes, different techniques for lighting them, and different methods of exhaling smoke to create the most photogenic effects. She studied photographs of Greta and other successful actresses, analyzing their smoking poses with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts for hidden meanings. But Marlene's attempts to manufacture the kind of mysterious allure that seemed to come naturally to Greta revealed the fundamental impossibility of authentically performing authenticity. The more consciously she tried to smoke with Greta's enigmatic sophistication, the more forced and artificial her gestures became. Photographers and directors could sense the calculation behind her smoking performances, and audiences responded with the kind of lukewarm reception that spelled doom for actresses trying to establish themselves in Hollywood's brutally competitive marketplace. The failure of Marlene's smoking performance taught her a crucial lesson about the nature of addiction and authenticity in Hollywood. She realized that the actresses who seemed most natural and compelling on screen were often those whose addictions were most genuine and uncontrolled. The smoking that looked most effortless was actually the product of the deepest dependencies, and the gestures that seemed most spontaneous were often the result of the most desperate needs. This revelation pushed Marlene toward a more dangerous approach to smoking that would ultimately prove more successful professionally, but far more destructive personally. Instead of trying to manufacture the appearance of addiction, she began deliberately cultivating genuine dependency smoking more heavily and more compulsively until her need for cigarettes became real enough to create the kind of authentic desperation that cameras could capture and audiences could sense. The transformation was remarkable to observe. Within months, Marlene's smoking had acquired the kind of urgent authenticity that had eluded her during her period of calculated performance. She was no longer acting addicted, she was actually addicted, and the difference was visible in every gesture, every inhalation, and every moment of anxiety when cigarettes were unavailable. Directors began offering her roles that required the kind of desperate sophistication that only genuine addiction could provide. And audiences responded with the kind of fascination that had previously been reserved for actresses like Greta and Barbara Lamar. But Marlene's success came at a price that extended far beyond her physical health. The addiction she had cultivated for professional purposes began to shape every aspect of her personal life, creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that her rivals and colleagues were quick to exploit. Studio executives who had once struggled to find leverage over her behavior now had a powerful tool for manipulation, and they used her smoking habits to control everything from her social relationships to her creative choices. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the professional manipulation. Marlene found herself unable to distinguish between the addiction she had created for her career and the authentic needs and desires that had motivated her original decision to become an actress. She was smoking to cope with the stress of maintaining a persona that was based on smoking, trapped in a recursive loop that made genuine self-expression increasingly impossible. This pattern of manufactured addiction spreading into authentic dependency was becoming disturbingly common throughout Hollywood, as actresses discovered that genuine suffering often translated into more compelling screen performances. The studios actively encouraged this development because actresses who were genuinely struggling with addiction were often more malleable and desperate than those who were merely performing addiction for professional purposes. Constance Bennett, the blonde socialite who had entered films almost by accident, found herself pressured to develop more authentic smoking habits after her initial performances were criticized as too polished and artificial. Constance had grown up in a wealthy family where smoking was considered vulgar and inappropriate for ladies, and her natural resistance to cigarettes had initially made her an appealing choice for roles that required wholesome American femininity. But as Hollywood's appetite for dangerous women continued to grow, Constance's wholesomeness became a liability rather than an asset. Casting directors began suggesting that she needed to develop more edge, more complexity, more of the mysterious allure that audiences associated with sophisticated smoking. The implicit message was clear. If she wanted to continue getting leading roles, she needed to become the kind of woman who smoked with genuine need rather than polite social conformity. Constance's initiation into serious smoking was orchestrated by a publicity agent who understood that her transformation needed to appear natural and spontaneous rather than calculated and professional. He arranged for her to attend a series of exclusive parties where smoking was not just expected, but required for social acceptance, where her refusal to smoke would mark her as naive and unsophisticated in ways that could damage her career prospects. The strategy was brilliantly effective because it exploited Constance's natural insecurities about her place in Hollywood's social hierarchy. As someone who had grown up with money but lacked the artistic credibility that other actresses possessed, she was particularly vulnerable to suggestions that her wholesomeness was actually a sign of inexperience and provincialism. The cigarettes offered at these parties weren't just tobacco products. They were tickets to acceptance and credibility that she desperately wanted but had never known how to earn. Within weeks, Constance was smoking regularly and finding that cigarettes helped her navigate the social and professional challenges that had previously left her feeling anxious and out of place. The transformation in her screen performances was immediately apparent to directors and audiences who had grown tired of her earlier, more innocent persona. She began getting offered roles that required greater emotional complexity and psychological sophistication, parts that showcased her newfound to convey the kind of world-weary elegance that cigarettes seemed to provide. But Constance's success in developing a more compelling screen persona came at the cost of her connection to her authentic self and her family background. The smoking that had initially been a professional tool gradually became a barrier between her and the people who had known her before her Hollywood transformation. Her family members, who had raised her to value health and propriety, found themselves unable to relate to the woman she was becoming. And Constance discovered that the cigarettes that made her more appealing to Hollywood audiences made her increasingly alienated from her own history and values. The generational conflict that emerged around Constance's smoking habits reflected broader tensions in American society about women's roles and the pace of social change. Her mother, who had fought for women's suffrage and believed deeply in women's capacity for moral leadership, was horrified to see her daughter embracing habits that seemed to represent everything vulgar and self-destructive about modern life. Her father, a successful businessman who had always prided himself on his family's respectability, found his daughter to himself unable to introduce worrying about what colleagues without her smoking habits might suggest about his own values and judgment. These family dynamics created additional pressure for Constance, who was simultaneously trying to maintain her professional success in Hollywood and preserve her relationships with people who had loved her before she became famous. She found herself smoking differently when she was with her family, trying to minimize the habit that had become central to her professional identity, but this effort to compartmentalize her addiction only increased her psychological stress and made her more dependent on cigarettes as a coping mechanism. The tragedy of Constance's situation was that she had sacrificed her authentic relationships for professional success, but the professional success was based on maintaining an addiction that prevented her from accessing the genuine emotions and experiences that might have made her a truly great actress. She was trapped in a performance of sophistication that kept her isolated from both her past and her authentic self, smoking to maintain an image that made genuine connection with others increasingly impossible. This pattern of isolation and alienation was becoming endemic among Hollywood's smoking actresses, who found that their addictions created barriers to authentic intimacy, even as they made them more appealing to audiences who mistook their desperation for sophistication. The cigarettes that promised connection and social acceptance ultimately delivered loneliness and dependency, but the women who experienced this betrayal were often too deep into their addictions and their careers to recognize what was happening to them. Aileen Pringle, the sophisticated British actress who specialized in playing worldly women with mysterious pasts, embodied this tragic contradiction perfectly. Aileen had come to Hollywood with genuine sophistication and life experience, having traveled extensively in Europe and lived independently as a young woman in ways that were unusual for her generation. Her smoking habits were initially authentic expressions of her cosmopolitan background rather than calculated performances designed for career advancement. But Hollywood's machinery quickly began to exploit and distort Aileen's natural sophistication, transforming her genuine worldliness into a marketable commodity that required constant performance and maintenance. Studio publicists created elaborate backstories that exaggerated her European connections and mysterious romantic history, and they encouraged her to smoke in ways that reinforced these fictional narratives rather than expressing her authentic personality and experiences. The transformation was subtle but devastating. Aileen found herself smoking not because she enjoyed it or because it helped her cope with stress, but because it was expected of her as part of the sophisticated European persona that had been constructed around her career. She was required to smoke at publicity events, during interviews, and in social situations where her failure to live up to her mysterious image might damage her professional prospects. This constant performance of sophistication gradually eroded Aileen's connection to her authentic experiences and memories feel like. She began to fraud even when she was engaging in behaviors that had once been genuine expressions of her personality and background. The cigarettes that had once connected her to her European adventures and independent lifestyle became props in a performance that made those authentic experiences feel false and commercialized. The psychological dissonance created by this transformation was enormous because Aileen was simultaneously more successful professionally than she had ever imagined possible and more alienated from her authentic self than she had ever been in her life. She was earning substantial money playing versions of herself, but those versions were so distorted and commercialized that they bore little resemblance to the woman she actually was or wanted to become. This commodification of authentic experience was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Hollywood's exploitation of women's smoking habits. The industry took women's genuine sophistication, independence, and worldliness, then packaged and sold these qualities back to them in forms that were simultaneously familiar and completely artificial. The actresses found themselves performing exaggerated versions of their own personalities, smoking to maintain images that were based on their authentic selves but had been distorted beyond recognition by commercial interests. The broader cultural impact of this manipulation extended far beyond Hollywood itself, because these performances of authenticity were being broadcast to audiences across America who had no way of distinguishing between genuine sophistication and manufactured rebellion. Young women in small towns were copying smoking styles and attitudes that they believed represented authentic, feminine independence, unaware that they were actually mimicking advertising campaigns designed to create new markets for tobacco products. Dorothy Sebastian, the dark-haired beauty who had grown up on a farm in Alabama, experienced this cultural manipulation from both sides when she discovered that her authentic rural background had been transformed into a marketable asset that required constant performance and exaggeration. Dorothy had started smoking as a teenager because it was one of the few ways she could rebel against the restrictive social expectations of her small southern community, and her smoking habits were genuinely connected to her desire for independence and self-expression. But when she arrived in Hollywood, Dorothy discovered that her authentic rebellion was not interesting enough for the industry's purposes. Studio executives wanted her to embody a more extreme version of Southern Gothic femininity, complete with smoking habits that suggested dangerous sensuality rather than simple teenage rebellion. They encouraged her to smoke with the kind of sultry intensity that would reinforce stereotypes about Southern women while appealing to audiences who fetishized regional differences and exotic femininity. The pressure to exaggerate her authentic background created a profound identity crisis for Dorothy, who found herself unable to distinguish between her genuine personality and the amplified version that Hollywood demanded. She was smoking more heavily and more theatrically than she had ever smoked in Alabama. But she was also being celebrated for her authenticity and naturalness in ways that made her question whether her original smoking habits had been as genuine as she had believed. This confusion about the nature of authenticity versus performance became a central psychological challenge for many actresses who discovered that their most intimate habits and personal characteristics had been transformed into professional assets that required constant maintenance and development. They were being paid to be themselves, but the selves they were being paid to be were often so distorted and commercialized that the original person disappeared entirely behind the performance. The economic incentives that drove this transformation were staggering, because the tobacco industry was discovering that actresses could be incredibly effective marketing tools for reaching female consumers who had previously been resistant to cigarette advertising. The companies were willing to pay substantial sums to ensure that their products were associated with the most appealing and sophisticated women in America, and they developed increasingly elaborate strategies for integrating their marketing messages into the authentic lives and habits of Hollywood stars. These financial relationships created conflicts of interest that made it impossible for actresses to maintain authentic relationships with their own habits. Every smoking cigarette became a potential business transaction. Every smoking gesture became a possible marketing opportunity, and every moment of genuine addiction or struggle became a commodity that could be exploited for commercial purposes. Evelyn Brent, the dramatic actress who specialized in playing femme fatale and dangerous women, found herself trapped in one of these commercial relationships when she signed an exclusive endorsement deal that required her to smoke a particular brand of cigarettes in all public appearances for a period of 5 years. The contract seemed lucrative and relatively unrestrictive when she signed it, but Evelyn quickly discovered that it gave the tobacco company unprecedented control over her personal habits and public behavior. The company's marketing team began dictating not just which cigarettes Evelyn had to smoke, but how she had to smoke them, what she could say about them, and even how many she had to consume during photographed events. They provided her with specially designed cigarette cases and lighters that featured their branding, and they required her to use these props in ways that would create subliminal advertising messages for audiences who thought they were simply watching her live her life. The psychological impact of this level of commercial control was devastating, because it made it impossible for Evelyn to maintain any authentic relationship with smoking as a personal habit or coping mechanism. Every cigarette became a performance for unseen audiences. Every moment of smoking became a potential violation of her contractual obligations, and every impulse to smoke differently or less frequently became a threat to her financial security and professional standing. Evelyn later described feeling like she was living inside a cigarette advertisement 24 hours a day, unable to smoke for her own pleasure or comfort, without considering how her behavior might be perceived by the company's marketing executives. Her addiction had been completely commercialized, transformed from a personal habit into a business asset that belonged more to the tobacco company than to her own body and psyche. This commercialization of addiction represented a new form of exploitation that went far beyond traditional employment relationships because it involved the systematic manipulation of psychological and physical dependencies for profit. The tobacco companies weren't just buying advertising space. They were purchasing control over the most intimate aspects of women's daily lives, their stress responses, and their coping mechanisms. The broader implications of this commercial control extended throughout Hollywood's social and professional networks, because other actresses could see what was happening to their colleagues and understood that similar arrangements might be offered to them. The industry was creating a culture where women's addictions were viewed as valuable business assets rather than personal health concerns, and where the most successful actresses were often those who were willing to allow their dependencies to be most thoroughly exploited for commercial purposes. This systematic commodification of addiction created perverse incentives that encouraged actresses to develop more severe and visible dependencies, because these were more valuable to advertisers and more appealing to audiences who associated addiction with sophistication and rebellious independence. Women found themselves competing to see who could appear most authentically addicted, most genuinely desperate for cigarettes, and most convincingly dependent on tobacco for their emotional and psychological well-being. The competition reached its most disturbing expression in the phenomenon of smoking contests that began appearing at Hollywood parties and industry events. These contests, which were ostensibly light-hearted entertainment, actually functioned as informal auditions, where actresses could demonstrate their smoking abilities to producers, directors, and advertising executives, who might offer them future work based on their performance. The contests involved various challenges designed to test different aspects of smoking skill and addiction, from speed smoking competitions to elaborate trick smoking demonstrations that required extensive practice and genuine nicotine tolerance. Winners received prizes that included cash, jewelry, and promises of future film roles. But the real reward was the professional recognition that came from being acknowledged as one of Hollywood's most accomplished and appealing smokers. Betty Compson, the red-headed actress who had started her career as a dancer, found herself drawn into this competitive smoking culture despite her initial reluctance and her awareness of the dangers involved. Betty had been smoking moderately for several years, but she had never considered her smoking habits to be particularly skillful or noteworthy. When she was invited to participate in a smoking contest at a major studio party, she initially declined because she felt unprepared and outclassed by actresses who had developed more elaborate smoking personas. But the social pressure to participate was enormous, and Betty quickly realized that her refusal to compete was being interpreted as evidence that she lacked the sophistication and worldliness that Hollywood valued in its leading ladies. The other actresses at the party were encouraging her to participate, but their encouragement carried undertones of challenge and judgment that made it clear that her standing in the community was being evaluated based on her willingness to demonstrate her smoking abilities publicly. Betty's decision to enter the contest marked a turning point in her relationship with cigarettes and with her own sense of professional identity. She spent the weeks leading up to the event practicing different smoking techniques, increasing her daily cigarette consumption to build tolerance, and studying the styles of actresses who were known for their smoking prowess. What had started as a social obligation gradually became an obsession that consumed her thoughts and shaped her daily routines. The contest itself was both thrilling and horrifying for Betty, that she possessed a natural talent for the kind of dramatic smoking that impressed judges and audiences. She won several categories, including Most Elegant Smoking Style and Most Convincing Portrayal of Smoking Addiction. But her victories came at the cost of a genuine addiction that developed during her period of intensive preparation and performance. The irony was that Betty's success in the smoking contest led directly to better film roles and higher salaries, but it also created a dependency that made her increasingly desperate and unstable in ways that affected every aspect of her personal and professional life. She had won the contest by developing genuine smoking skills and authentic addiction, but the addiction that made her valuable professionally also made her vulnerable to the same kinds of manipulation and exploitation that were affecting all of Hollywood's smoking actresses. The normalization of these smoking contests reflected the broader cultural acceptance of addiction as entertainment that was characteristic of a 1920s Hollywood. Audiences were fascinated by the spectacle of beautiful women destroying themselves in elegant and photogenic ways, and the industry was happy to provide this entertainment as long as it remained profitable and controllable. But the contestants themselves were often unaware of how completely they were being exploited for the entertainment of others. They genuinely believed that they were participating in harmless social events that showcased their sophistication and worldliness, not realizing that they were actually providing free marketing for tobacco companies and free entertainment for audiences who were consuming their genuine suffering as a form of voyeuristic pleasure. The psychological damage inflicted by this systematic exploitation was profound and lasting because it transformed women's most intimate struggles with addiction into public performances that could be judged, criticized, and commodified by strangers. The actresses lost not only their health and their authentic relationships with their own habits, but also their privacy and their right to struggle with addiction as a personal rather than public experience. The most devastating aspect of this exploitation was how it stripped these women of their right to private struggle, transforming their most vulnerable moments into commodities for public consumption. By the mid-1920s, the line between genuine addiction and performed addiction had become so blurred that even the actresses themselves couldn't distinguish between their authentic needs and their professional obligations. This confusion reached its most tragic expression in the story of Corinne Griffith, the ethereal blonde who had earned the title the Orchid Lady of the Screen for her delicate beauty and seemingly fragile persona. Corinne's relationship with cigarettes began innocently enough, as a way to calm her nerves during the transition from stage to screen work. But the studios quickly recognized that her natural anxiety and vulnerability could be transformed into a marketable asset if properly cultivated and displayed. The transformation of Corinne's genuine nervousness into a commercial smoking persona was orchestrated with clinical precision by publicity executives who understood that audiences were drawn to women who appeared to be on the verge of emotional collapse. They encouraged her to smoke during interviews in ways that emphasized her fragility, holding cigarettes with trembling fingers and exhaling smoke with the kind of shaky breaths that suggested barely controlled hysteria. What made Corinne's situation particularly cruel was that her performed vulnerability was rooted in authentic psychological distress that the studios were deliberately amplifying for commercial purposes. She was genuinely struggling with the pressures of fame and the demands of maintaining her ethereal image. But instead of receiving support or treatment, she was being encouraged to exaggerate her struggles and display them publicly as entertainment for audiences who mistook her genuine suffering for sophisticated acting. The cigarettes that had initially provided Corinne with a small measure of comfort during stressful situations gradually became instruments of her own torture. She was required to smoke during publicity events, even when she was feeling calm and confident, because her image depended on maintaining the appearance of fragile instability. She found herself smoking not to cope with authentic stress, but to create the artificial stress that her public persona required. This reversal of cause and effect created a psychological nightmare for Corinne, who was simultaneously being celebrated for her authenticity and being required to manufacture the very emotions and behaviors that made her seem authentic to others. She was smoking to appear nervous, then becoming genuinely nervous about her ability to maintain the appearance of nervousness that her career required. The studio executives who orchestrated this manipulation understood perfectly what they were doing to Corinne, but they justified their actions by pointing to her commercial success and the genuine admiration she received from audiences who found her vulnerability appealing. They convinced themselves that they were simply helping her capitalize on her natural characteristics, not acknowledging that they were systematically destroying her psychological well-being for profit. Corinne's descent into genuine instability was gradual but inexorable. The performed anxiety became real anxiety, the artificial fragility became genuine weakness, and the cigarettes that had once been props became desperate necessities for surviving each day of performance and pretense. She began smoking compulsively off camera, chain smoking through sleepless nights spent worrying about whether she could maintain her image and continue earning the money that had become essential to her survival. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that Corinne's audiences genuinely cared about her and wanted to protect her from the very exploitation they were unknowingly supporting through their ticket purchases and magazine subscriptions. They saw her smoking as evidence of her sensitive artistic temperament, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of systematic abuse, and their sympathy and concern only increased the pressure on her to maintain the vulnerable persona that was destroying her. Meanwhile, the emergence of talking pictures was creating new challenges for actresses whose careers had been built around their ability to smoke elegantly and dramatically. The transition to sound films required different skills and different types of performances, and many of the women who had mastered the art of silent-era smoking found themselves struggling to adapt their techniques to the demands of dialogue and synchronized sound. Vilma Banki, the Hungarian actress who had become one of the biggest stars of the silent era, discovered that her heavily accented English made her less marketable in talking pictures, but her smoking skills remained valuable for the increasingly sophisticated cigarette advertisements that were beginning to dominate American media. Vilma found herself caught between two different forms of exploitation, valued more for her ability to make smoking look appealing than for her dramatic talents or creative contributions. The transition was particularly painful for Vilma because she had genuinely loved acting and had hoped to develop her craft and take on more challenging roles as she gained experience and confidence. Instead, she found herself being offered primarily advertising work that required her to smoke in ways that would sell cigarettes to American women who admired her exotic sophistication and European glamour. The advertising contracts were lucrative, but they required Vilma to abandon any pretense that her smoking was connected to her authentic personality or artistic expression. She was required to smoke specific brands at specific times while delivering scripted testimonials about the quality and appeal of particular tobacco products. Her smoking became entirely divorced from her own needs or desires, transformed into a mechanical performance designed to generate sales rather than express anything genuine about her character or experiences. This commodification of smoking reached its most extreme expression in the emergence of cigarette-sponsored radio programs that featured Hollywood actresses discussing their smoking habits and preferences with listeners across the country. These programs were presented as intimate conversations between sophisticated women, but they were actually elaborate advertising campaigns that used the actresses' apparent authenticity to sell tobacco products to audiences who believed they were receiving genuine advice and recommendations. Joan Bennett, the youngest of the Bennett sisters, found herself hosting one of these radio programs despite her private reservations about promoting smoking to young women who looked up to her as a role model. Joan had started smoking as a teenager in rebellion against her mother's strict rules, but she had always maintained some awareness of the health risks and social costs associated with the habit. The radio program required Joan to present smoking as an essential aspect of modern feminine sophistication, discussing different brands and smoking techniques with the kind of enthusiasm and expertise that would convince listeners to experiment with cigarettes themselves. She was required to share personal anecdotes about how smoking had helped her in various situations, creating fictional stories that would make cigarettes seem like solutions to the kinds of problems that young women commonly faced. The psychological toll of this constant promotion of habits she privately questioned was enormous for Joan, who found herself developing a split personality that allowed her to enthusiastically recommend smoking on the radio while privately worrying about the impact of her words on impressionable listeners. She began smoking more heavily off the air, using cigarettes to cope with the guilt and anxiety generated by her public promotion of a habit she was beginning to recognize as destructive. The irony was that Joan's authentic concern for her listeners made her a more effective spokesperson for the tobacco industry because her genuine warmth and sincerity came through in her radio performances, making her recommendations seem trustworthy and caring rather than commercial and calculated. The tobacco executives who sponsored her program understood that her moral ambivalence actually made her more valuable as a marketing tool because it gave her endorsements an emotional complexity that purely commercial advertisements lacked. This exploitation of moral complexity was becoming a standard technique throughout the advertising industry, which had discovered that consumers were more likely to trust spokespersons who seemed to have genuine relationships with the products they were promoting. The actresses who appeared most conflicted about their smoking habits were often the most effective at convincing others to adopt similar habits, because their apparent struggle suggested that they had made informed decisions based on careful consideration of the costs and benefits involved. Leatrice Joy, the dramatic actress who had specialized in playing sophisticated society women, found herself trapped in this dynamic when she agreed to appear in a series of cigarette advertisements that required her to discuss the role of smoking in her personal and professional life. Leatrice had always been ambivalent about her smoking habits, recognizing that they helped her cope with professional stress, while also acknowledging that they were affecting her health and her relationships with non-smoking friends and family members. The advertisement campaign was designed to capitalize on this ambivalence by presenting Leatrice as a thoughtful, intelligent woman who had carefully weighed the pros and cons of smoking before deciding that the benefits outweighed the risks. The ads featured her discussing her decision-making process in detail, explaining how she had considered various factors before concluding that smoking was an essential part of her sophisticated lifestyle. What made these advertisements particularly insidious was that they transformed Leatrice's genuine struggle with addiction into a rational choice that other women could emulate without feeling guilty or conflicted about their own decisions. The ads suggested that smoking was not a sign of weakness or lack of self-control, but rather evidence of sophisticated judgment and mature decision-making that marked the difference between modern, independent women and their more traditional counterparts. The campaign was enormously successful in convincing women that smoking was a sign of intelligence and sophistication, rather than addiction and dependency. But it also trapped Leatrice in a public persona that made it impossible for her to acknowledge her own growing concerns about her tobacco use. She had become the public face of rational smoking, and any admission of doubt or regret would have undermined the very message that was making her valuable to the tobacco industry. This transformation of addiction into choice was perhaps the most sophisticated form of manipulation employed by the tobacco industry, because it allowed women to feel empowered and independent, even as they were being systematically exploited and controlled. The advertisements convinced them that their smoking habits were expressions of their intelligence and sophistication, rather than symptoms of their vulnerability to commercial manipulation and chemical dependency. The success of these campaigns was reflected in the dramatic increase in women's smoking rates throughout the 1920s, as millions of American women adopted habits that they believed represented liberation and modernity, but were actually designed to create new markets for tobacco products. The actresses who served as the public faces of these campaigns were simultaneously the architects and victims of this massive cultural transformation, using their own addictions to create addictions in others, while losing their own capacity for authentic self-expression and genuine independence. The psychological costs of this role reversal became apparent in the increasing rates of mental illness, suicide, and self-destructive behavior among Hollywood's smoking actresses. Women who had come to Los Angeles seeking creative fulfillment and personal freedom found themselves trapped in cycles of addiction and exploitation that made authentic self-expression increasingly impossible, while the smoking habits that had initially promised sophistication and independence became barriers to genuine intimacy and meaningful relationships. Clara Bow's later years exemplified this tragic trajectory. By 1927, she was smoking 6 packs a day and suffering from anxiety attacks that made it difficult for her to work or maintain relationships. The cigarettes that had once made her feel sophisticated and rebellious had become desperate necessities for surviving each day of performance and pretense. She would wake up each morning reaching for cigarettes before she was fully conscious, and she would fall asleep each night with cigarettes burning in ashtrays beside her bed. The transformation from rebellious teenager to desperate addict had been so gradual that Clara herself couldn't pinpoint when smoking had stopped being fun and started being survival. She would try to quit periodically, motivated by concerns about her health and her increasingly obvious dependence. But the withdrawal symptoms were complicated by the professional demands that required her to maintain her smoking persona even when she wanted to escape it. The studios that had initially celebrated Clara's smoking as evidence of her modern femininity now used her addiction as a tool for controlling her behavior and maintaining their investment in her career. When she tried to negotiate for better working conditions or higher salaries, executives would schedule meetings during times when they knew she would be craving cigarettes, using her dependency to make her more compliant and desperate for quick resolutions to conflicts. This systematic exploitation of addiction for purposes of labor control represented a new form of workplace abuse that went far beyond traditional power dynamics because it involved the manipulation of chemical dependencies for economic advantage. The studios weren't just controlling their actresses' professional activities, they were controlling their neurochemistry and using their physical needs as weapons against their attempts to assert independence or demand better treatment. The broader implications of this exploitation extended throughout American society as the smoking habits promoted by Hollywood actresses influenced the behavior of millions of women who had no understanding of the commercial forces that had shaped those habits. Young women across the country were adopting smoking styles and attitudes that they believed represented authentic rebellion and independence, unaware that they were actually copying advertising performances designed to create new consumer markets. The cultural transformation was so complete that by the end of the 1920s, smoking had become virtually synonymous with modern femininity in ways that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The actresses who had served as the unwitting architects of this change found themselves prisoners of their own success, trapped in addictions that had outlived their usefulness but remained essential to their professional survival and public identity. The most tragic aspect of this transformation was how it had perverted the very ideals of liberation and independence that had originally motivated these women to challenge social conventions and pursue careers in Hollywood. The cigarettes that had initially symbolized their rejection of traditional feminine roles had become instruments of a different kind of oppression, one that was more subtle but ultimately more destructive than the social restrictions they had sought to escape. As the decade drew to a close, the full scope of this tragedy was beginning to become apparent to some of the more perceptive observers of Hollywood culture. The women who had pioneered smoking as a form of feminine rebellion were aging prematurely, suffering from health problems that were clearly related to their tobacco use, and displaying signs of psychological instability that suggested their apparent sophistication had come at an enormous personal cost. But the machinery of exploitation had become so sophisticated and so profitable that it continued to operate even as its human costs became increasingly obvious. New generations of actresses were arriving in Hollywood each year, eager to adopt the smoking habits and sophisticated personas that had made their predecessors famous, unaware of the price that previous generations had paid for their apparent glamour and independence. The cycle was becoming self-perpetuating, with each generation of actresses using their own addictions to create addictions in others, while the tobacco industry and Hollywood studios profited from the systematic destruction of women's health and autonomy in the name of liberation and sophistication. The smoke that had once seemed to represent freedom had become a fog of deception that obscured the true nature of the exploitation taking place beneath its elegant and seductive surface. The web of manipulation became even more insidious as the decade progressed, with tobacco companies developing increasingly sophisticated methods for turning actresses into unwitting sales representatives for their products. What had begun as simple endorsement deals evolved into comprehensive lifestyle management contracts that controlled every aspect of these women's public appearances and private habits. The companies discovered that consumers were more likely to trust recommendations that appeared to come from genuine personal experience rather than obvious commercial arrangements. So they began orchestrating elaborate scenarios designed to make their marketing campaigns look like authentic lifestyle choices. Nita Naldi, the dark-haired actress who had made her reputation playing exotic temptresses and dangerous foreign women, found herself at the center of one of these sophisticated manipulation campaigns when she was approached by executives from a major tobacco company who claimed to admire her natural elegance and sophisticated smoking style. They offered her what seemed like a simple arrangement. She would continue smoking exactly as she always had, but she would make sure to use their brand exclusively during any public appearances or photographed events. The contract seemed almost too good to be true because it required no additional work or performance from Nita. She was already smoking constantly, already appearing at parties and premieres where photographers would capture her elegant gestures, and already embodying the kind of mysterious sophistication that made other women want to emulate her style. The tobacco company was essentially paying her to continue living her life exactly as she had been, with the minor modification of switching to their particular brand of cigarettes. But Nita quickly discovered that this apparently simple arrangement was actually an elaborate form of behavioral modification designed to make her more dependent on both the tobacco company and the habits they were paying her to maintain. The executives began sending her cases of their cigarettes on a regular schedule, ensuring that she never had to purchase tobacco or make conscious decisions about when and how much to smoke. They provided her with elaborate smoking accessories that featured subtle branding elements, transforming every aspect of her smoking ritual into a marketing opportunity. More insidiously, the company began monitoring her public appearances and providing feedback about her smoking performance that gradually shaped her behavior in ways she didn't consciously recognize. They would compliment her when she smoked in particularly photogenic ways, suggest minor adjustments to her technique that would create better visual effects, and gently discourage habits that didn't align with the sophisticated image they wanted to promote through her endorsement. Within months, Nita's smoking style had been subtly modified to conform to the company's marketing objectives, but the changes were so gradual and seemingly natural that she never realized her authentic habits were being systematically replaced by calculated performances designed to sell cigarettes to other women. She was becoming a more effective advertisement for tobacco products, but she was also losing touch with her own genuine relationship to smoking as a personal coping mechanism and source of comfort. The psychological manipulation reached its peak when the company began orchestrating social situations designed to showcase Nita's smoking in the most appealing context possible. They would arrange for her to attend parties where photographers would be strategically positioned to capture her smoking during moments of apparent spontaneous enjoyment and relaxation. They would introduce her to other actresses who were also under contract to companies, creating the tobacco appearance of a natural community of sophisticated smoking women who had independently chosen similar habits and lifestyles. These manufactured social networks served multiple purposes for the tobacco industry. They provided actresses like Nita with peer-made their support that commercial arrangements feel more like authentic lifestyle choices. They created opportunities for cross-promotion between different brands and different celebrity endorsers. And they generated a constant stream of seemingly candid photographs that could be used in advertising campaigns without appearing overtly commercial. The actresses involved in these networks genuinely believed they were forming authentic friendships based on shared interests and similar lifestyles, unaware that their social circle had been carefully constructed by marketing executives who understood that peer influence was more powerful than traditional advertising in convincing women to adopt new behaviors. They would gather at exclusive events where smoking was not just encouraged, but required for social acceptance, reinforcing each other's habits, while providing content for publicity campaigns that portrayed smoking as an essential aspect of sophisticated social life. Jetta Gaudel, the French actress who had brought continental elegance to Hollywood's rough edges, became one of the most effective participants in these manufactured social networks because her genuine European sophistication made other actresses feel that smoking was an authentic expression of worldly experience rather than a calculated commercial performance. Jetta had been smoking since her teenage years in Paris, where cigarettes were considered normal aspects of adult social behavior rather than rebellious statements or marketing opportunities. But when she arrived in Hollywood, Jetta discovered that her authentic European smoking habits were being transformed into valuable commercial assets that could be used to sell American women on the idea that cigarettes represented sophistication and continental glamour. Tobacco companies began approaching her with offers to appear in advertisements that would emphasize her foreign background and suggest that smoking was an essential aspect of the kind of worldly experience that American women should aspire to acquire. The advertisements featuring Jetta were brilliantly designed to exploit American women's insecurities about their own sophistication and worldliness. They suggested that smoking was something that naturally sophisticated European women did without thinking about it, implying that American women who didn't smoke were revealing their provincial backgrounds and limited life experience. The campaigns positioned cigarettes not as consumer products to be purchased, but as markers of cultural sophistication that separated worldly, experienced women from their more naive and sheltered counterparts. Jetta's participation in these campaigns was motivated partly by financial necessity and partly by her genuine desire to share what she saw as the positive aspects of European culture with American women who seemed eager to expand their horizons and embrace more liberated lifestyles. She didn't initially recognize that her authentic cultural background was being exploited to create artificial desires and dependencies in women who had no organic connection to European smoking traditions. The psychological impact on Jetta was profound because she found herself becoming increasingly self-conscious about habits that had once been natural and unconscious expressions of her cultural background. Every cigarette became a potential performance for audiences who were analyzing her behavior for clues about how to achieve the kind of sophistication she seemed to embody effortlessly. She began smoking more deliberately and theatrically, transforming unconscious habits into conscious performances that gradually replaced her authentic relationship to tobacco with calculated gestures designed to meet others' expectations. This transformation from authentic cultural expression to commercial performance was particularly painful for Jetta because it involved the gradual loss of connection to her own background and identity. The European sophistication that had once been a natural aspect of her personality became a market that she was able commodity required to perform for audiences who had no understanding of the cultural contexts that had originally shaped her behavior. The tobacco companies recognized self-consciousness about her smoking, that Jetta's growing actually made her more valuable as a marketing tool because her increased deliberateness created more photogenic and dramatic gestures that were easier to capture in advertisements and publicity photographs. They began encouraging theatrically, providing her to smoke more with elaborate cigarette holders and smoking accessories that would create more striking visual effects and more memorable advertising images. Meanwhile, the competition between different tobacco companies was intensifying as they recognized the enormous potential profits available from successfully marketing cigarettes to American women. Each company was developing its own stable of actress endorsers and its own approach to associating smoking with particular aspects of feminine appeal and social status. The result was a complex web of competing marketing campaigns that used Hollywood's most glamorous women as weapons in commercial battles that the actresses themselves barely understood. Louise Fazenda, the comedic actress who had built her career playing working-class characters and small-town women, found herself caught in the middle of one of these commercial wars when two different tobacco companies began competing for her endorsement. Louise's appeal was different from that of more glamorous actresses because she represented the kind of authentic American femininity that resonated with women who saw themselves as practical and down-to-earth rather than exotic and sophisticated. The tobacco companies recognized that Louise could help them reach market segments that were not responding to campaigns featuring more obviously glamorous actresses. Working-class women and small-town residents might be intimidated by the continental sophistication of someone like Jetta Goudal, but they could relate to Louise's apparent authenticity and practical approach to life. If Louise could be convinced to endorse smoking as a normal part of everyday American life, she could influence millions of women who had previously seen cigarettes as symbols of urban sophistication that had no relevance to their own lives and experiences. The competition for Louise's endorsement became increasingly intense and sophisticated as both companies recognized her potential value. They began offering not just money, but comprehensive lifestyle packages that would elevate her social status and provide her with the kind of glamorous lifestyle that had previously been available only to more traditionally beautiful actresses. They promised to transform her from a character actress into a leading lady, using their marketing resources to create a moraling public appeal image that would make her eligible for better roles and higher salaries. Louise was initially skeptical of these offers because she had always prided herself on her authenticity and her connection to ordinary American women who saw her as a relatable representative of their own experiences and aspirations. She worried that accepting a tobacco endorsement deal would compromise her credibility and make her seem like just another Hollywood actress who had sold out to commercial interests rather than remaining true to her working-class roots. But the financial incentives were enormous, and Louise was also attracted by the possibility of using tobacco company resources to advance her career and gain access to better roles that would allow her to showcase her dramatic abilities rather than being typecast in comedic parts that limited her range as an actress. She eventually signed with one of the competing companies, but she insisted on contract terms that would allow her to maintain some control over how her endorsement was presented to the public. The campaign that emerged from Louise's endorsement deal was groundbreaking in its approach to marketing cigarettes to working-class and rural women who had previously been ignored by tobacco advertisers. Instead of emphasizing sophistication and glamour, the advertisements featuring Louise portrayed smoking as a practical habit that helped ordinary women cope with the stresses and challenges of everyday life. She was shown smoking while doing household chores, while taking breaks from factory work, and while relaxing with friends and family members who were also portrayed as normal, relatable people rather than glamorous celebrities. The campaign was enormously successful in expanding the market for cigarettes among demographic groups that had previously shown little interest in tobacco products, but it also had devastating consequences for Louise's relationship with her own authentic identity and her connection to the communities she had originally represented. She found herself smoking constantly to maintain the image of smoking as a normal part of everyday life, but her increased tobacco consumption was affecting her health and her ability to perform the physical comedy that had made her famous. More troubling was the way the campaign changed Louise's relationship with her own background and the people who had originally supported her career. Family members and friends from her hometown began to express concern about her tobacco use and her apparent transformation from a wholesome, relatable performer into someone who seemed to be promoting habits that they saw as dangerous and inappropriate for the kind of woman Louise had once represented. The psychological pressure was enormous because Louise was simultaneously being celebrated for her authenticity by tobacco company executives and being criticized for her apparent inauthenticity by the very people whose approval had originally motivated her to pursue a career in entertainment. She was caught between two different definitions of authenticity, neither of which seemed to leave room for her own genuine feelings and desires about smoking and her career. The broader cultural impact of Louise's endorsement campaign extended far beyond her personal struggles, because it marked a turning point in the tobacco industry's approach to marketing cigarettes to American women. The success of her campaign demonstrated that smoking could be effectively promoted as a normal aspect of everyday life, rather than a symbol of rebellion or sophistication, opening up vast new markets among women who had previously seen tobacco use as incompatible with their values and lifestyles. This shift toward normalizing smoking as part of ordinary women's daily routines was supported by increasingly sophisticated psychological research that tobacco companies were conducting to understand how to overcome resistance among different demographic groups. The companies were discovering that many women were more likely to adopt smoking habits if they could be convinced that cigarettes were practical tools for managing stress and maintaining energy rather than symbols of rebellion or markers of social status. Baby Daniels, the versatile actress who had successfully transitioned from comedy to drama and was known for her intelligence and business acumen, became involved in one of these psychological research projects when she was approached by tobacco executives who claimed to be conducting a study of how successful women managed stress and maintained their energy levels during demanding careers. Bebe was initially flattered by their interest in her professional strategies and was eager to share insights that might help other women achieve similar success in male-dominated industries. The interviews began innocuously enough, with researchers asking Bebe about her daily routines, her methods for preparing for difficult roles, and her techniques for maintaining focus during long working days. But the questions gradually became more specific about her smoking habits, with researchers showing particular interest in when she smoked, how smoking affected her mood and performance, and what she believed cigarettes contributed to her ability to handle professional pressure. Bebe initially thought she was participating in legitimate research that would contribute to scientific understanding of how successful women manage their careers. But she gradually realized that the study was actually a sophisticated market research project designed to develop more effective strategies for marketing cigarettes to professional women. The researchers were analyzing her responses to identify psychological triggers and emotional needs that could be exploited in future advertising campaigns. The realization that her genuine insights about professional success were being used to manipulate other women into adopting potentially harmful habits was deeply disturbing for Bebe, who had always prided herself on her intelligence and her ability to see through commercial manipulation. She felt betrayed by the researchers who had misrepresented the nature of their project, but she also felt complicit in a system that was using her authentic experiences to create artificial desires in women who looked up to her as a role model. The incident made Bebe much more conscious of how her public statements and behavior were being analyzed and potentially exploited by commercial interests that had no concern for her well-being or the well-being of the women who were influenced by her example. She began to realize that every aspect of her public persona was potentially valuable to marketers who were constantly looking for new ways to associate their products with the kinds of success and sophistication that audiences admired. This growing awareness of commercial manipulation made Bebe increasingly paranoid about her own motivations and authentic desires. she found herself questioning whether her smoking habits were genuine expressions of her personality and stress management needs, or whether they had been shaped by the same kinds of subtle manipulation that she now understood were being used against other women. The line between authentic choice and commercial influence had become so blurred that even intelligent, successful women like Bebe were losing the two distinguish between their genuine preferences and the desires that had been artificially created through sophisticated marketing techniques. The psychological uncertainty created by this realization was compounded by the economic pressures that made it difficult for actresses to completely withdraw from commercial relationships with tobacco companies. Even women who recognized that they were being exploited often felt that they had no choice but to continue participating in endorsement deals and promotional campaigns because the financial rewards were too substantial to abandon, and because refusing to participate might result in being blacklisted by an industry that was increasingly dependent on tobacco advertising revenue. Lois Wilson, the dramatic actress who had specialized in playing virtuous heroines and moral exemplars, experienced this economic coercion firsthand when she attempted to withdraw from a tobacco endorsement deal after recognizing that her participation was encouraging young women to adopt habits that were clearly affecting their health and well-being. Lois had initially agreed to the endorsement because she believed that her reputation for moral integrity would make her recommendations seem trustworthy and reliable. But she became increasingly uncomfortable as she observed the impact of her promotional work on impressionable fans. The tobacco company's response to Lois's attempt to withdraw from her contract revealed the true nature of the power dynamics that controlled Hollywood's relationship with commercial sponsors. Instead of allowing her to leave gracefully, the company threatened to use its influence with studio executives and theater owners to damage her career prospects if she violated her contractual obligations. They reminded her that tobacco advertising revenue was essential to the financial viability of many entertainment industry businesses, and that actresses who interfered with these revenue streams could expect to find themselves unemployable. The threat was not idle, because tobacco companies had indeed developed extensive networks of influence throughout the entertainment industry, providing financial support to studios, theaters, magazines, and radio programs that made them powerful allies and dangerous enemies for individual performers. Actresses who challenged tobacco interests often found themselves facing mysterious difficulties in securing roles, obtaining publicity, or maintaining the kinds of social and professional relationships that were essential to career success in Hollywood. Lois's situation was particularly painful because she was being forced to choose between her moral principles and her economic survival, with no option that would allow her to maintain both her integrity and her career. She eventually decided to honor her contractual obligations while privately supporting organizations that were beginning to research the health effects of tobacco use, but the compromise left her feeling complicit in a system that she recognized as fundamentally exploitative and harmful. The broader pattern of economic coercion that Lois experienced was becoming increasingly common throughout Hollywood as tobacco companies consolidated their influence over the entertainment industry and developed more sophisticated methods for controlling the actresses who served as their marketing representatives. The companies were no longer content to simply purchase endorsements. They wanted comprehensive control over their spokespersons' public statements, social relationships, and even private behaviors that might affect their value as advertising assets. This totalitarian approach to celebrity management was exemplified by the experience of Helene Costello, the younger sister of more famous actress Dolores Costello, who signed an endorsement deal that she later discovered gave the tobacco company unprecedented control over her personal life and career decisions. The contract included clauses that required Helene to obtain company approval before making any public statements about health, lifestyle, or social issues, and that gave the company veto power over roles that might conflict with the wholesome image they wanted to maintain for their brand. Helene initially thought these contract terms were reasonable restrictions that would protect both her reputation and the company's marketing interests, but she quickly discovered that they gave tobacco executives effective control over every aspect of her career and personal life. She was required to decline roles that involved characters who didn't smoke, prohibited from associating with actors or activists who were critical of tobacco use, and obligated to attend social events where her smoking would be photographed and used in promotional materials. The psychological impact of this comprehensive control was devastating because it made Helene feel like she was living her entire life as a performance for tobacco company executives who had no interest in her well-being or authentic happiness. Every decision she made had to be evaluated for its potential impact on her value as a marketing asset, and every relationship she formed had to be analysed for its compatibility with the wholesome smoking persona that the company was using to sell cigarettes to young women. The isolation created by these restrictions was compounded by the fact that Helen couldn't discuss her situation with friends or family members without eating the confidentiality clauses in her contract that prohibited her from revealing the extent of the tobacco company's control over her life. She was trapped in a prison of artificial authenticity, required to appear happy and fulfilled, while being systematically stripped of the autonomy and genuine relationships that might have provided her with real satisfaction and meaning. The tobacco company's control over Helene's life extended even to her romantic relationships, as executives began expressing concern that her association with men who didn't smoke might send conflicting messages about the social acceptability and desirability of tobacco use. They began introducing her to actors and other entertainers who were also under contract to tobacco companies, creating a dating pool that was carefully curated to ensure that her romantic choices would reinforce rather than undermine the marketing messages that her endorsement was designed to promote. This manipulation of intimate relationships represented the ultimate invasion of privacy and personal autonomy, transforming even the most basic human needs for love and companionship into opportunities for commercial exploitation. Helene found herself unable to trust her own romantic feelings because she could never be certain whether her attractions were authentic or whether they had been artificially manufactured through the careful orchestration of her social environment by marketing executives who understood that romantic relationships could be used to reinforce consumption patterns and brand loyalties. The psychological fragmentation created by this comprehensive manipulation was so severe that many actresses began to lose the ability to distinguish between their authentic personalities and the commercial personas that had been constructed around their endorsement deals. They were living lives that had been designed by marketing committees, rather than emerging from their own genuine desires and values. But the artificial nature of their existence had become so normalized that they often couldn't recognize how completely they had been transformed into commercial products rather than independent human beings. Virginia Valley, the dramatic actress who had built her reputation playing strong, independent women, exemplified this psychological fragmentation when she began experiencing panic attacks and identity crises that seemed to be triggered by moments when she was required to smoke for publicity photographs or promotional events. Virginia had originally enjoyed smoking as a private pleasure and stress relief mechanism, but the commercialization of her habit had transformed it into a source of anxiety and confusion that made her question her own authenticity and autonomy. The panic attacks were particularly disturbing because they occurred during moments when Virginia was supposed to be performing the kind of confident, sophisticated femininity that had made her valuable to tobacco advertisers. She would begin smoking for a photograph or promotional event. But instead of feeling the calm and confidence that cigarettes had once provided, she would experience overwhelming anxiety about whether her gestures were authentic or artificial, whether she was expressing her genuine self or performing a role that had been scripted by marketing executives. The attacks created a vicious cycle because Virginia's anxiety about performing authenticity made her smoking appear forced and unnatural, which led to criticism from tobacco company executives who demanded more convincing performances of sophisticated enjoyment. Their pressure to appear more genuinely satisfied with smoking only increased her anxiety about the artificial nature of her endorsement work, creating a feedback loop that made it increasingly difficult for her to access any authentic relationship with tobacco or with her own desires and preferences. Virginia's experience revealed the psychological impossibility of maintaining genuine authenticity while participating in commercial relationships, that required the systematic performance of artificial desires and manufactured preferences. The tobacco companies wanted her to appear genuinely satisfied with smoking, but genuine satisfaction was incompatible with the conscious calculation and deliberate performance that her endorsement work required. She was trapped in a paradox that made authentic expression impossible while demanding increasingly convincing performances of authenticity. The broader implications of Virginia's psychological crisis extended throughout Hollywood as other actresses began recognizing similar patterns in their own relationships with tobacco endorsement work and commercial sponsorship deals. Many women were discovering that the financial benefits of these arrangements came at the cost of their ability to maintain authentic relationships with their own habits, preferences, and desires. But the economic pressures that had led them into these deals made it difficult to withdraw without facing severe professional consequences. The situation was further complicated by the fact that audiences genuinely admired many of these actresses and trusted their recommendations because they seemed to represent authentic expressions of sophisticated femininity and independent choice. Fans had no way of knowing that their favorite stars were performing carefully scripted roles, rather than sharing genuine insights about lifestyle choices that had brought them satisfaction and success. The actresses were trapped between their obligations to their commercial sponsors and their sense of responsibility to fans who looked up to them as role models and sources of guidance. Ruth Rowland, the athletic actress who had made her reputation in adventure serials and action films, found herself particularly conflicted about her tobacco endorsement work because she recognized that many of her fans were young women who admired her strength and independence, but might not understand the health risks associated with smoking. Ruth had always prided herself on promoting positive messages about women's physical capabilities and encouraging her fans to pursue active, healthy lifestyles that would allow them to achieve their full potential. The tobacco endorsement deal that Ruth eventually signed represented a fundamental compromise of her original values and mission as an entertainer, but the financial incentives were too substantial to ignore, particularly as her action film career was beginning to decline due to changing audience preferences and the increasing popularity of more glamorous, less athletic leading ladies. The tobacco company offered her a chance to remain financially stable and professionally relevant while transitioning to a different type of career that would capitalize on her established fan base and reputation for authenticity. The advertisements featuring Ruth were designed to suggest that smoking was compatible with athletic activity and physical fitness, positioning cigarettes as tools that could help active women manage stress and maintain energy during demanding physical challenges. The campaigns featured Ruth smoking before and after various athletic activities, suggesting that tobacco use could actually enhance rather than hinder physical performance and overall health. The scientific absurdity of these claims was apparent to medical professionals who were beginning to understand the negative effects of smoking on cardiovascular health and athletic performance. But the tobacco company's marketing research had revealed that many consumers were willing to believe that cigarettes could be beneficial if the claims were presented by trusted figures who appeared to embody health and physical fitness. Ruth's reputation for strength and athleticism made her an ideal spokesperson for these misleading messages because her obvious physical capabilities seemed to contradict any suggestion that smoking might be harmful. The psychological toll of promoting messages that Ruth privately suspected were false and potentially dangerous was enormous, particularly as she began receiving letters from young female fans who were adopting smoking habits based on her recommendations and then reporting health problems that seemed to be related to their tobacco use. Ruth found herself in the impossible position of being financially dependent on promoting a product that was apparently harming the very people she had originally wanted to help and inspire. The guilt and anxiety created by this situation was compounded by Ruth's growing awareness that her own smoking habits were affecting her athletic performance and overall health in ways that made it increasingly difficult for her to maintain the physical capabilities that had originally made her valuable as both an entertainer and a tobacco spokesperson. She was caught in a cruel irony where the product she was promoting was undermining her ability to provide convincing evidence of its supposed benefits, But her contractual obligations prevented her from acknowledging this contradiction publicly. The smoke finally began to clear by 1929, but not in the way anyone expected. As the stock market crashed and the glittering facade of the Jazz Age crumbled, the women who had pioneered smoking as a symbol of liberation found themselves prisoners of the very habits they had believed would set them free. Their rebellion had been packaged, marketed, and sold back to millions of American women who never understood they were buying their own chains. The cigarettes that promised sophistication delivered addiction. The smoke that seemed to represent freedom became the fog that obscured decades of manipulation and control. These women didn't just change Hollywood, they changed America forever.